What happens when cybersecurity governance isn't taken seriously? Today, regulators don't just want checkboxes, they want proof that your controls actually work. Because without it, you're exposed to risk from both attackers and regulators alike. Well, this shifting landscape has caught many organizations off guard. So when I reviewed Worldwide Technology's security priorities for 2025, I expected AI or threat detection. Instead, priority one, define, assess, and improve your cybersecurity governance program.
What? Huh?
Why is governance suddenly leading the charge? Because it's evolved. It's no longer an IT function. It's now a business necessity, as well as a board-level strategic imperative. Joining me today are Mario and Mike from Worldwide Technology. They help organizations transform compliance-driven thinking into risk-driven strategies that align security with business objectives. My name is Rob Boyd. Welcome to WWT Presents Research. I want to start with Mario and have you guys do some introductions, but I wonder, Mario, could you start with explaining what do you do for Worldwide Technology?
Hi, Rob. Thanks for having us on. So to start off, my role specifically is to lead a team of professionals who are former CISOs and practitioners with a primary goal of establishing relationships and strategic trust with our customers at the right level. So we are directly involved and engaged with those key stakeholders and giving them the benefit from a practitioner standpoint that we know the challenges they face and that we can help them directly.
That's huge, because I don't think I realized that I've always been impressed with the various titles that I come across in all types of verticals and backgrounds at Worldwide, but I did not realize that you had enough former CISOs that you would actually have a group that you lead to do that. And so what that says about experience on the ground, I think, must speak volumes to clients. Mike, what do you do for Worldwide? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I lead our cyber governance, risk, and strategy practice. We help clients actually advance their programs, cyber programs, their capabilities, help them understand the risks that they're dealing with, and then we help them mitigate those risks through various types of services and capabilities we bring to the table.
I've kind of want to slot Mario into big picture strategic type things with customers, although I know you guys have overlapping capabilities. And then Mike, it sounds like you're very much in the middle with you and your teams about how do we make this actually work. I like that. For this discussion, I just like some kind of contrast in terms of what we do. But it kind of jumped out at me that governance was number one on the priority list. And it's not to say that it shouldn't be by any means. It feels like to me, in my experience, that governance and compliance or things like this, important, always important, but sometimes relegated to behind other items. Is this significant thing to bring up in terms of, is there a change afoot? Have things happened? Is this a good thing? Or am I just now personally catching up? Mario, I'll have you reflect on that first.
Yeah, I think, Rob, more than ever, governance and risk management is a top order of concern at the, let's say, at the upper level, at the uppermost level of decision makers and companies. And the reason being is it's got a different face to it, meaning if you reflect back perhaps, let's say 3, 4, 5 years, compliance was still handled as a measure of demonstrating how you meet a standard and being evaluated at that standard. And a company replied by saying, wherever there's deficiencies, we will address them and reply accordingly. What's different today is the real question. And that comes down to when you look at the threat landscape and what's happened within that time, it's also changed. So there's a requirement to put in an adaptation to how companies protect their business. And remember, some of those companies, their business is around critical infrastructure, right? So there's an aspect of the private sector being an important part of critical infrastructure. And the reason why I mention that is because it elevates the requirement to do real risk management in a very different way. Those standards, while they are more demanding, what's also different is how organizations are being evaluated to them being able to meet them. And that to me is what we're really talking about here. What is that difference? and how it's approached.
Mike, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this as well. Are we seeing a change in the risk landscape that is being addressed differently by regulators, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of change that has occurred over the last several years, and I think the key is into what Mario said, risk management. I think there's a better understanding that everything that we do is really more about risk management, and compliance is just one of the ways that you help manage your risk better at the end of the day. So that's one thing. I think everyone's understanding, that this is all about managing risk and understanding what those risks are. Those risks have changed, right? The threat landscape, as Mario referred to, has exponentially increased over the last several years and will continue to do so. But there's other factors, I think, that has now, allowed governance to kind of raise itself up a little bit more. As an example, companies today are even more reliant on third parties to provide critical business services, right? And they're understanding that that's not disconnected anymore. That's actually part of their business operation, and that's part of their business risk they have to understand. There's emerging technologies that are out there. Cloud and AI are just other examples.
I've heard of this AI
none of these
thing,
things are mutually exclusive now. I think that's the recognition. And so governance is now become more in the forefront of saying it's not just one thing we have to pay attention to. We have to pay attention to all these things because they're all kind of interconnected at the end of the day. So I think that has lent itself to a bigger focus on governance and how it works, and how it plays its role in risk management.
Well, and I think, if I recall, you mentioned any organization is not necessarily free of the mistakes that their partners make, per se, in terms of how regulators are looking at that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think there's the difference is, when supply chain management and third-party risk management, to me, have become a little more intertwined, particularly because it's not just I'm manufacturing and my supply chain is all about getting the various raw materials that I need to build product, right? That's one type. It's now the focus is on these companies. As an example, in the financial world, banks are relying on third parties to deliver critical business services to their clients at the end of the day. So it's the game has changed radically, and I think that is the influence that we are seeing today of why people are understanding that governance over all of that is much more important than it was 5-6 years ago.
When we say that there's a lot more stringent aspects of how you demonstrate risk, let's give an example, right? In the past, you reply to sort of the checklist you called out, but now you have to show evidence. And evidence means
receipts.
You have to bring in all your information around an architecture, around the security capabilities. And not only do you have to show these plans, which could be hundreds of pages, you might also have to show a test plan and how you're executing tests against those controls. So it's no longer just a compliance for the aspect of a layer of bureaucracy, which a lot of people, I think, were the biggest complaints. So now there's this requirement, and I think what it also does is it puts organizations to be more thorough and to be more specific and to demonstrate how these things that they're doing can meet or exceed the expectations of compliance. However, it is also, more importantly, how they're making decisions around risk. And I think that's the number one thing we have to remember in this conversation. We're calling it governance, but really, ultimately, it's about protecting the business.
If you ask any regulator, right, a few years ago, they were more interested in the basics, right, getting things in place and so forth. Now, what they want to understand is that you understand the actual risk, that you can demonstrate that you understand that risk, and then show what you're doing to handle that risk, whether it's transference, whether it's we're taking care of it, right, whether we have a risk appetite for it and we're accepting it, whatever it is, that they'll come back and say, we'll get to your capabilities, we'll get to all that, we want to check, make sure you're doing all the right things, but we're going to start with, you have to show us and demonstrate that you clearly understand the risk you're dealing with. That to me is a big difference because just a few years ago they were more focused on, do you have these things in place to help protect the data? Now it's, what are the risks that you're dealing with?
Am I correct in assuming that there's probably some kind of an assessment of damages? Like if you're found negligent.
So if we look at last year, there was a couple of key incidents where CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers of said organizations, are being held accountable, not because of the breaches, in this case, that occurred, but how they responded or how they communicated what they did or didn't do. There's an understanding that you can't prevent all breaches. That is certainly known by all the professionals dealing with cyber. I think it comes down to when a breach occurs, and now you're, depending on what industry vertical, the global financial services is one that stands out, you have to answer, and you're on notice, and you send out a notice. So there's a series of very, very specific call outs on what you got to do that are legally binding, meaning if you don't do them, there'll be significant repercussions, however it falls out. So yes, absolutely. I think that stands because of the seriousness of what these incidents are, and the fact that one incident at a particular organization is undoubtedly going to affect third parties, or whether the third parties affected, there's this chain reaction.
Yeah. We're also intertwined.
Yes, there's a chain reaction. So, and really, years ago we used to say, your risk chain is only as good as the weakest link, and so that's why there's this emphasis in the importance of what governance can do, and it could provide value in your strategic approach and how you make decisions on what you're going to proceed with. So there is a value. It's not all about something I have to do and it's an overhead.
Well, that sounds like a mind shift that you guys are encouraging too, which is a security investment in this area should not be viewed as an expense you're constantly trying to reduce. These things also get infinitely more complex when you talk about, if you're a global multinational, then you're going to have different regulations and different expectations across the board. Maybe the only way to approach this is to say, what's the most stringent, and then how do I constantly strive for that? But hopefully you're doing it for the reasons not to avoid fines and avoid negative press, but you're doing it because that's what's a good way to run your business, and there's positive benefits from that.
When it started out, it was more about considering it more of a necessary evil, right? You just had to do this stuff. And now, I think as companies have matured in their understanding and of not only the security threats, but also risk management, they've also started looking at it and saying, hey, how is this a competitive advantage for us, right? That we actually have the right level of security, and we want to tout that, right, at the end of the day. And I think that's because consumers of all these services and products understand the space a lot better than they did 10 years ago right now. And so they're demanding that, right? So there's definitely a shift in that. Now, to your comment on, do you always go to the most stringent? That's sort of like very, very difficult to do, even with the largest financial institutions, which spend billions of dollars in this space, in the cyberspace annually, right? Even there, they're going to have a risk-based approach on what capabilities they have in place and what they're doing and so forth. And that's just common sense. And I think even regulators today still understand that fact that you can't do everything, right? Because your business is not cyber, your business is financial products. So I think that those things are always still in balance, right? That's we have a lot of those conversations with our clients. We're always constantly helping them mature in this area, keep you're okay in this area, but understand what the risk is, what the residual risk is, and so forth. That I don't think will ever change because there's not an unlimited checkbook. I mean, it's still at the end of the day, you're taking money away from the business strategy, right? To do these things, right? So you've got to have that constant balance. But that also comes back to why governance is so much more important today. Because if you have effective governance in place, you understand those risks and what you're doing, and you have a better balance of what you're investing to protect everything and what you're investing to execute the business strategy.
There's a portion of every research paper that gets very tactical. What I'd like to do is go through 5 steps as talked about in the research paper that we're focused on for this priority. And it's assess and ID gaps is the first one. I'll just go through these real quick and then we'll go through them. Number 2 is build a cross-governance team. Then there's number 3, address emerging security gaps. Then number 4, implement reporting and monitoring. And then there's kind of what I call this, circling it back again, which is a continuous improvement and adaptation. Mario, I want to start with you on assess current security and identifying gaps in what you're doing. Do you feel like people there might be some things that people tend to do wrong when it comes to these kind of areas? And
I think every organization, from a diligence standpoint, should do some sort of self-assessment. That is a part that demonstrates you're actively involved, you're serious about what you need to do, and you've got thoughts and plans around it. But I would say, Rob, to a part of that, and I don't want to call it step 0, but an important part of that is that back to the company and the senior decision makers, the board, however, the most executive level, they need to call out what's the most important to them, to the business, and what they want to protect against. Right? Yeah. So there's basically, most companies will want to protect their brand, or they want to demonstrate that they're compliant because that could be significant fallout, or they want to protect data, or they want to have ensure operational capability. And there's sort of this large set of things that everybody wants to do, but they need to narrow it down to probably the top 2 or 3 things. From there, a review, self and third-party assessments should hone in on that, because otherwise you're going to make it unyieldy. I think the mistake is that everybody's trying to look at this very big area that is incredibly challenging, but really when you come down to it, there needs to be clearly stated decisions on what are the most important things. And then you build your strategy and the compliance and the risk, and you focus on that.
Well, I can see where that really cuts a lot of extra, potentially wasted work, because a lot of people in an organization are going to have different opinions about what they think is most important based on their viewpoint and their position. And that's why you need that, as you're saying, to come from the executive level.
Yes, and that's a great comment, because when we do this and sit with companies and we sit with the C-suite, we ask them to write down, we give them some guidance. So we say, of these things, what is the most important to you? And if there's 10 people in there, the last person you want to speak is the CEO, but everybody else speaks because the CEO could drive it. And then you will not get the same 3 from any 2 people. Okay?
Yeah.
And then you start to help and facilitate. But that's an example of why that is so important.
It reveals to everybody.
Yes.
Yeah. That we're on a different page. And then the CEO is going to weigh in as a tiebreaker. Well, these things are important, but here's where we're going to actually allocate resources based on, hopefully, the risk associated with it. Mike, I feel like you've also said compliance does not equal security. I figure that's something some people may have to overcome if the two don't necessarily equal each other.
It's an old story of, hey, I've done everything against the requirements and these standards or these frameworks, but when you actually look at what is going on, again, the traditional 3 pillars, people, process, technology, you may come back and say, you know what, it's not very good at the end of the day. So you may be compliant, technically, word to word, but when you look at it, you're not really secure, and you can show them why, right? And again, it comes back to understanding, again, the risks that you're really facing, and did you really get that capability to the right level based upon who you are and what threats and so forth that you have to deal with. Many types of risk assessments, right? We usually get input from the C-suite, from business owners, from security, and it's shocking how on different pages they are on everything, what the priorities are and so forth. And you have to remember, business folks, they want to enable their strategy. But however, now you have connecting worlds that you have to be, you have to have a reality about. Example would be, okay, in order to execute that business strategy, we need to put workloads in the cloud. That's a whole different ballgame now. Oh, and guess what? That workload is going to be an AI-based workload. Now I just made it even more complex at the end of the day. So what's our priority now of how we're going to do this? If you want to get to that endpoint, we have to do A, B, C, and D in order to make sure that that is going to be secure at the end of the day. I think when you talk about making mistakes, I think it's not, when you don't see that whole picture, when you have things too disconnected, and you're maybe too siloed off from reality of what's really going on out there. And so, as Mary said, self-assessments are absolutely needed to show that you are keeping your finger on your pulse, but bringing in, outside independent people to look at what you're actually doing gives you a flavor from one, different expertise coming to the table, but also the understanding of what others are doing as well. So leading practices to the table. We get a lot of questions from clients, which are great questions about how are others dealing with this? How are they looking at this, right? Because they want to digest and understand that. They want to feel like, hey, are we way behind what our peers are at the end of the day? Are we doing the right thing? We're seeing more and more of those questions being asked about, are we doing the right thing at the right level, than I've seen in years past. Again, because I think the light bulb's gone off around the risk management, the interconnectivity of all these things that we now see today. So I think, again, I don't like to think in terms of mistakes as much as just the evolution of the mindset, evolution of the understanding of what's going on here. And I see that happening, which I think is fantastic. Can't happen fast enough, actually.
Yeah, but it's nice. What you're saying is we're kind of moving beyond the having to convince people that this is something they need to do, and now you're slowly moving more into, well, how do I actually do it? And the answer to how, of course, changes fast these days. Number 2 is build a cross-functional governance team. And so as you talked about step 0 or step something before that first step, I can't imagine the amount of learning that can occur when you can get kind of even just senior leadership in a room to kind of share opinions and biases and preferences and lay it all out on the table and say, well, how are we going to do what's best for the business?
Well, first of all, it's critical. And it's critical for the obvious reasons that there's one unified objective and goals that they are seeking, and there's no disconnect. Because let's face it, the biggest thing that everybody worries about it is, can I meet the funding requirement of what I need to do? So yes, we're touching on the importance of protecting the business, but now we're talking about a return on investment. So the cross collaboration and the communication across that everyone agrees and understands allows you to make sure that the investments are being made in the best way possible. The disconnects are undoubtedly going to create some sort of waste or some sort of redundancy that you want to avoid, or even worse, that the priorities are not being addressed. So yes, communication is absolutely vital.
Because there's also an expectation that following those type of steps in the process, that there's all right, everybody, you may not have gotten exactly what you expected or thought or whatever it may be, but this is the direction we're now rowing.
Yes.
Based on a decision that was made. And then I would assume the governance team is not something that meets once. This is something that's an ongoing process designed to weigh in and on the fact that this stuff isn't going to be static. Mike, what are your thoughts on getting across these silos? Because that seems to be the number one thing we deal with across every technology set, which is, wow, guys, we're going to start talking more. Get to know how each other's business works.
Yeah, I think I try and simplify this when I look at it. All these complexities have exponentially grown over the last few years. If you can't figure out how to bring it together and act in a coordinated way, speed will kill you, right? You won't be able to move fast enough because everything will be done in pockets. They'll take their time. And by the time an actual decision is made, you've missed the mark. Right?
The ground has changed.
You want to get speed to market is always the key. And what also happens there is those disconnected governance processes take their time. At the end of the day, the developers and the business are starting to move out anyway. They're going to go, you know what, we're just going to go because we have to go for the business. Right? And now they're introducing tons of risk because they're moving out ahead of it, but the governance process wasn't able to keep up with the speed the business needs them to do. So to me, that is a huge part of this because there are more complexities to it. Use the example I had where it's a cloud-based application, AI use case combined, right? You have to weigh in on both those things in order to understand the risks around all of that to make a decision, do you move forward or not? Individually, that could take too long. If you bring it together and you have a coordinated fashion, you can come to a conclusion faster, understanding all the risks better, and helping that business move better, faster to market with the product.
Your analysis paralysis has really got to be one of those things that creeps into something like this. Cloud's one thing. I feel like we understand it a lot better than we used to, and it feels like there's at least theoretically the ability to really understand what the edges are. But AI, I feel like we don't know the edges of AI yet. We're being forced to make decisions about using this technology in an environment where we don't fully understand exactly how it works. It's still somewhat of a black box, and I don't think we understand how far it goes. Is that fair?
I think that's totally fair. That's 100% fair, right? And it's not necessarily new. It's been around for a long time. I think it's just exploding in people understanding how they can actually now use it, right? And they're wanting to move fast at it, but you have to have governance around it, governance and controls around it, right? It's all connected to, why is governance so important these days? Is because all these things are now coming together, and you have to manage all that risk faster, right? It's one thing to say I have to manage all this risk and it's going to take me 3 times as long. That's not the answer. It's got to take me 1/3 time less in order to manage all that complex risk. That's the challenge that I think businesses face today.
I want to go on to number 3, where we talk about addressing emerging security gaps.
I mean, third-party risk, again, has also become more complex, mainly because the third parties now are providing more and more business-critical functions to businesses, clients, and so forth. Whereas before they may have been more in the background, right? Like, hey, we're taking care of your data center, versus now this company is actually responsible for that financial product that we're selling to our clients. So I think that landscape has changed dramatically. Fintech, insurtech, all those types of things have influenced all of that, right? And made it more complex. So, and now on top of that, again, I'll go back to AI. Now some of those products are AI based. Now you have to understand, even though it's a third party, now I have to make sure that third party that's providing that product to me now is doing all the right things around AI that they need to be doing. So the whole thing now is just it's getting wrapped around more complexity because of emerging technologies, which are great. We need them, right? We want it to continue. But at the same time, you have to step back and say, how has the risk now changed? And how do we deal with that risk?
Advances in technology occur because there's a better way to make business profitable or enhance, improve, call it what you want. If the security strategy is tightly woven and integrated into that, then you can make sure that you're addressing it to go back to managing the risk. You're not going to prevent it. You don't want to prevent it, right? Innovation is the key to anything or any organization. And innovation comes in many different ways, but without question, the introduction of new technologies or new capabilities have to be embraced in a smart way. And that's where this really kind of the things that we're talking about have an interplay, a very important interplay.
Moving on to number 4, and reporting and monitoring, and I don't know who to credit with this, so feel free to jump in if necessary. Governance without measurement is just documentation. Does that, Mario, you're nodding. I wonder whether you said it or not. Can you explain the importance of reporting and monitoring and where that fits into this?
Reporting and monitoring, first of all, let's be clear. It's a mandatory requirement, but I don't want to make it sound like you're doing it. What I mean by that is it's the way you communicate and you identify and you build, I'll call it, clearly defined roles of what you want to do and who has to do it and who has the ownership. To me, the whole part about reporting gets a little bit twisted, but this is around having the right people be held to a certain level of accountability because it's important. But it's also around ensuring that those individuals or those groups that have these responsibilities are properly vetted and resourced to meet the expectations. So there's more than just, oh, I got to develop a report or I got to build a presentation. It's around having that tie-in and making sure that the people who are responsible, not only are they doing it, yeah, let's face it, but they're also well resourced, they've identified issues, they're part of the long game, and they're focused on short gains as well. That to me is all about reporting and monitoring.
Do regulators, are they looking at a level of proactivity, perhaps, that needs to be demonstrated here too?
Oh, absolutely. It comes back to risk management, right? So you put something in place, you've identified the risk, you say this is how we're going to handle the risk. You put things in place, people, process, technology, right? Now the next question is, how do you know it's working? How do you know you're effectively managing that risk, right? How do you do that? Well, get data out of what you're doing and figure out exactly how to measure and monitor it. Give you an example. Patch management is usually the easiest one, or vulnerability management, either one, right? You run scans, you're always going to find something, always. If I run it today, I run it tomorrow, I'm going to find different things, right? You start looking at, okay, well, the risk is I found things and I have to take care of them. But in any environment, you're never going to be able to fix everything all the time. You may actually have some exceptions that require it to take a little bit longer to fix the problem that you identified because you had to fix a few other things up front in order to apply a certain patch to address it. Because if I just apply the patch, I might bring my application down. So I need to go actually do some updates to my application first and then apply that patch, right? So that's just normal. But understanding what is that for us? What's that number, right? Is it 2% on our high risk applications that go past the SLA, and we understand and we know that that's a normal number for us, and we know exactly where that 2% is, what we're doing about it, we have plans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If I see that move up to 4%, guess what? That's telling me automatically my risk has gone up. My risk is trending up. Why? Now I have to go figure out why. That's the importance of reporting and measuring and monitoring. So it's not just, hey, we're getting data and we're showing we're doing things, that we're running scans. It's looking into it and saying, what are you finding? What's the risk? And how are you measuring and monitoring that what you're doing is taking care of that risk effectively? And that's what auditors look at, right? So they're going to look at they're going to look at the controls, they're going to look at everything, but they're going to come back and come back to that one point and saying, you understand what the risk is and show us how you're actually monitoring and measuring that you're handling, that the things you're doing are actually addressing that risk.
You're establishing tripwires that say, if we reach certain thresholds, we need to have some way of knowing that the team needs to be engaged, that we need to respond differently, or that we need to adjust expectations, investments, activities, or like the frog boiling in water. It's, if you don't notice, then you run into the thing that none of us want, which is I don't want an auditor to find out where I made a mistake, and I don't want my customers to be the ones that became my early warning signal. Number 5, I think, is straightforward and simple: continuous improvement and adaptation. This to me is the call out that we're not done. This isn't something we budget for this year, and thank gosh we finished up that whole security thing. Is there anything else in terms of this being a competitive edge, perhaps?
It can absolutely bring a competitive edge in many ways. It's like, do you hire someone to do your plumbing at home that's certified and licensed or not? You want to have that sort of credential, I'll call it. I mean, and there's all kinds of ways being considered to really help companies evaluate and define that. So yes, there's clear value add, there's greater reliability, and even maybe notoriety in some cases that a company is doing what they're supposed to do, and it enhances, improve their ultimately position around business.
You never get to brag about the things you prevented, but you're definitely going to get credit for the things that didn't go the way they were supposed to. Is there any one thing that you wish more people would remember?
I think it just comes down to, being able to figure out kind of where you currently stand from a governance/risk management perspective, and not be afraid to to change and improve it. That always seems to get in the way because, again, a lot of these are sometimes separate groups, right?
Yeah.
And the willingness to say, maybe we need to look at this a little bit differently. If you can integrate it successfully, you can make things move faster and manage the risk better at the end of the day. That would be the main message, is to, you have to constantly look at it, tune it, tweak it, and keep it in sync with understanding the evolving risks that are going on out there. Until the bad guys call up and say, hey, we're done, we're not going to bother you anymore, you're constantly going to have to just keep looking at all this and be willing to make those changes and try and advance and innovate how you're doing governance today, understanding with all these different things that we talked about, all these different parts and pieces now are on the table, whereas before they necessarily weren't on the table. They were kind of separated, but now they're not necessarily separated. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me.
I feel like that's a mark of good leadership, the willingness to ask the questions that you may not like the answer to.
I think the biggest part of this is that companies need to take and embrace governance as a form of not only meeting the mandates, but expanding their business, promoting what they do, and having a structure in place that gives them the ability to be agile, innovative, and ultimately survive and grow and protect their business.
How does WWT help with these huge, intractable, difficult problems? What would you suggest?
We're able to come in and not only do the advisory consulting piece, we're able to roll the sleeves up and bring the tech in as well, automation, tools, technology. So we're that one-stop shop, right? Based upon whatever they think they need to improve, we have an answer for them at the end, and whether it comes from my group or somewhere else in WWT. So it's multiple dimensions, Rob, at the end of the day that we come to the table on. But starting up front with just helping them understand kind of how they look today and things to consider about making it better.
You guys bring in senior leadership, and I feel like if I'm somewhere in an organization and I've managed to convince my organization that we need to take a harder look at this because I feel like we're missing it, there's nothing I would like better than to have a third party such as you or Mike speaking to my CEO and the senior business leaders.
We talked about the importance of that senior level involvement and making those critical, important decisions, and that's where we can step in and help them. So within our Managed Advisory Risk Service, called MARS, we are able to bring our experts and do things that I believe would be very, very regarded, because we're bringing not only the experience, but what we're seeing across the industry and what we're seeing as common pitfalls and also strengths and characteristics, I should say, of what a successful compliance and governance capability ultimately for risk management looks like. That's our expertise.
I got to think that's a hard thing to do internally for yourself, because everybody's going to have a little bit of a guard up about someone feeling, that department suddenly looks like they're overstepping into my area, and, whatever little political fiefdoms or something exists. You guys are, neutral third party who's interested in helping them achieve an outcome of that experience that leads to the proper steps that need to be taken to move the ball forward, really.
That's exactly right. Being neutral and coming in and giving that fresh view and that trusted advisory. That's where we want to be.
Cybersecurity governance isn't just checking boxes anymore. It's enabling business in a risk-filled world. And as Mario put it, good governance gives companies, quote, the ability to be agile, innovative, and ultimately survive and grow. So when security and business priorities align, you move faster without sacrificing protection. The days of governance as a back-office function are over. It's now a competitive advantage that earns trust from customers, confidence from regulators, and a seat at the executive table. So are you ready to strengthen your approach? Download the 2025 Security Priorities Report using the link below, or connect directly with WWT's experts for everything from quick assessment to hands-on implementation. Thanks for joining us on WWT Presents Research. We'll see you next time.